For 854 days, a man sat alone in a concrete cell with no books, no human contact, and no clock. Held not by the Soviet Union, but by the United States government. His name was Yuri Nosenko. He was a KGB officer who had handed the CIA some of the most valuable intelligence secrets of the Cold War. He had come to America voluntarily. He had asked for protection. And for the next 10 years, the Central Intelligence Agency made his life a living hell. What you are about to hear is not a theory, it is not speculation. It is drawn from declassified CIA documents, Senate Intelligence Committee findings, and internal agency records that the government fought for decades to keep buried. The question at the center of this story is deceptively simple. Was Yuri Nosenko a genuine defector, or was he a KGB plant sent to deceive the most powerful intelligence agency in the world? The answer, when it finally came, revealed something far more disturbing than any Soviet spy operation ever could. Stay with this, because the answer changes everything you think you know about American intelligence. January 20th, 1964. Yuri Ivanovich Nosenko is 36 years old, and he is standing inside the American embassy in Geneva with a decision that cannot be undone. He tells CIA officer Tenant Bagley that he is a lieutenant colonel in the 2nd Chief Directorate of the KGB, the division responsible for counterintelligence inside the Soviet Union. He says he wants to defect permanently. And then he says something that stops Bagley cold. He tells the CIA that he personally handled the KGB file on Lee Harvey Oswald. John F. Kennedy had been assassinated 60 days earlier. The Warren Commission was still investigating. The entire world was asking whether the Soviets were involved. And here, in a Geneva embassy, was the KGB officer who claimed to have the answer. Nosenko told them the KGB had investigated Oswald when he defected to the Soviet Union in 1959, and that Moscow had concluded he was unstable, unreliable, and of no intelligence value. The KGB had never recruited him. The Soviet Union had nothing to do with Kennedy's assassination. This was either the most valuable intelligence gift the CIA had ever received, or it was the most sophisticated deception operation in KGB history. CIA officer Pete Bagley believed it was the latter, and that belief, unverified, unfalsifiable, held with obsessive certainty, would destroy an innocent man's life for a decade. To understand what happened to Yuri Nosenko, you have to understand one man, James Jesus Angleton, Chief of CIA Counterintelligence from 1954 to 1975. A man described by colleagues as a brilliant, paranoid spider sitting at the center of a web he had largely imagined himself. Angleton had become convinced, following the defection of Soviet agent Anatoly Golitsyn in 1961, that the KGB had penetrated the CIA at its highest levels, that a mole, perhaps multiple moles, was feeding Moscow everything, every operation, every source, every secret. Golitsyn had told Angleton something else. Something that would have catastrophic consequences for Nosenko. He told him that the KGB was planning to send fake defectors, what intelligence professionals call provocateurs, to discredit genuine intelligence and protect their real moles. Angleton believed every word of it. He had built an entire counterintelligence worldview around Golitsyn's claims. Any defector Golitsyn didn't personally vouch for was, by definition, suspect. And Golitsyn did not vouch for Nosenko. In fact, Golitsyn actively campaigned against Nosenko, calling him a KGB plant almost from the moment Nosenko defected. Golitsyn had reason to. If Nosenko was genuine, some of Golitsyn's own intelligence would be called into question. These two men's credibility was a zero-sum game. What followed was a bureaucratic and psychological war fought inside the CIA that would grind on for years. But while that war was being fought with paper and ink at Langley, Yuri Nosenko was paying the price in flesh. When Nosenko defected in January 1964, the CIA did not welcome him. They installed him in a safe house and began what they called a hostile interrogation, a systematic, relentless questioning designed not to gather information, but to break his story. Bagley and Angleton were looking for inconsistencies. They found some. Nosenko occasionally misremembered dates. He got certain details wrong. His recollections of specific KGB case files sometimes conflicted with earlier statements. To the CIA's mole hunters, these inconsistencies were proof of deception. To anyone else, they were what happens when a human being is under extreme psychological stress and asked to recall minute bureaucratic details from years earlier without access to his own records. 292 sessions. That number is not an estimate. It comes from CIA internal records declassified in the 1990s. In those sessions, interrogators applied every technique in their psychological arsenal, contradicting him, belittling him, confronting him with manufactured evidence, and telling him repeatedly that his cover story was falling apart. Nosenko maintained his story, every time, on every core claim. The KGB had not recruited Oswald. The Soviets had not killed Kennedy. He was a genuine defector. He had chosen America. And the CIA's response to this consistency? They decided to break him permanently. In August 1965, the CIA moved Nosenko to a purpose-built isolation facility at Camp Peary, Virginia, the agency's training base known internally as the Farm. What they built for him there had no official name. In internal documents, it was referred to only as the box. The room was 10 feet by 12 feet, concrete walls, a single light bulb that burned 24 hours a day, no windows, no books, no radio, no human contact, except for interrogators. The temperature was deliberately kept uncomfortable. Too cold in winter, suffocatingly hot in summer. 1,277 days, 3.5 years. In a room the size of a large walk-in closet, with no outside stimulus, no human connection, no way to measure the passage of time. The techniques being applied to Nosenko had a name. They came directly from the CIA's own classified interrogation manual. The Kubark Counterintelligence Interrogation Manual, produced in 1963. The manual explicitly described the use of sensory deprivation, sleep disruption, and total isolation as tools to induce psychological regression, to reduce an adult to a childlike state of dependency and compliance. The CIA knew exactly what this did to a human being. They had funded the research themselves through the MKUltra program, the covert mind control experimentation project that had already destroyed dozens of lives in the 1950s and early 1960s. They knew. That's what makes this different from ignorance. They knew precisely the psychological damage they were inflicting, and they inflicted it anyway. Modern neuroscience has quantified what prolonged isolation does to the human brain. After 72 hours of sensory deprivation, the brain begins generating its own stimuli. Hallucinations, paranoia, and phantom sounds are clinical certainties, not possibilities. After 30 days, subjects in isolation studies begin showing measurable deterioration in cognitive function, memory recall, and emotional regulation. After 90 days, the damage begins to appear structural. Changes in cortisol levels, changes in hippocampal activity. Nosenko endured over 4 times longer than the most extreme documented isolation periods in any legitimate scientific study ever conducted. CIA medical records, declassified decades later, show that officers monitoring Nosenko's condition raised concerns. They noted signs of psychological distress. They recommended review. Those recommendations were overridden by Angleton's counterintelligence division. Angleton was not interested in Nosenko's health. He was interested in one thing, forcing a confession that would validate his theory of Soviet penetration, and Nosenko refused to give it to him, even as his mind was being systematically destroyed. Nosenko later recalled that he survived by doing mathematics in his head, by reconstructing Soviet poetry from memory, by disciplining himself to think systematically when his brain was screaming for stimulus. He did push-ups in his cell. He counted ceiling tiles. He was not breaking, and that paradoxically made his captors more suspicious. Because in Angleton's worldview, a man who could withstand this treatment was not an innocent man. He was a trained KGB agent, steeled by Soviet psychological conditioning. There was no outcome in which Nosenko could prove his innocence. If he broke, he was guilty. If he endured, he was also guilty. The CIA had built a closed epistemic loop with a man's life trapped inside it. While Nosenko sat in his concrete cell, the Warren Commission was reaching its conclusions. In September 1964, it published its report. Lee Harvey Oswald had acted alone. The Soviet Union was not involved. The Commission's conclusion about Soviet non-involvement was substantially supported by Nosenko's account, but the CIA never told the Warren Commission that its primary source for Soviet exoneration was currently being held in solitary confinement and declared unreliable. That omission was not accidental. The CIA was deliberately keeping the Warren Commission in the dark about Nosenko's status, because acknowledging that its only direct KGB source on the Oswald file was considered a potential plant would have destroyed the Commission's confidence in its own findings. Read that again. The Warren Commission, the body that shaped America's official understanding of who killed its president, was drawing on intelligence that the CIA simultaneously considered to be Soviet disinformation. That contradiction has never been fully resolved. If Nosenko was genuine, and all evidence now strongly suggests he was, then the Commission got it right for the right reasons. If he was a plant, as Angleton believed, then the official conclusion about Kennedy's assassination was built on Soviet lies. The CIA chose to leave that question unanswered rather than release Nosenko. In 1967, a new team of CIA analysts was assigned to the Nosenko case. They were not from Angleton's counterintelligence division. They approached the problem without the ideological investment Bagley and Angleton had spent 3 years building. What they found was stunning. The evidence that Nosenko was a KGB plant was not evidence, it was interpretation. Every single inconsistency in his account that had been used to condemn him had an innocent explanation. The misremembered dates, consistent with genuine memory under stress. The conflicting case file details, consistent with a bureaucracy that compartmentalized information. He simply hadn't had access to everything. The implausibility of his rank, a later review confirmed his rank was accurately stated. The 1968 review concluded that there was no reliable evidence that Nosenko was a KGB plant. The case against him, assembled over 4 years of obsessive interrogation, did not hold up under neutral scrutiny. CIA Director Richard Helms received this review. He had the authority to release Nosenko immediately. He did not. Instead, Nosenko remained imprisoned in the same concrete room under the same conditions for another 4 years. The reasons were bureaucratic and political. Releasing Nosenko meant admitting the agency had tortured an innocent man for 4 years. It meant acknowledging that James Angleton's entire counterintelligence worldview, which was actively shaping CIA operations globally, might be built on a foundation of paranoid fantasy. The institutional cost of admitting the mistake was too high. James Angleton's mole hunt, which had justified Nosenko's imprisonment, was not just wrong about Nosenko. It was wrong about nearly everything. In pursuit of a Soviet penetration agent he never found, Angleton systematically destroyed the careers of dozens of loyal CIA officers. He subjected his own analysts to surveillance, suspicion, and hostile interrogation. He halted operations against the Soviet Union for years because he suspected everyone involved of being compromised. He created a counterintelligence apparatus so paralyzed by paranoia that the CIA's Soviet operations effectively ceased to function during the late 1960s. Historians and former CIA officers have since concluded that Angleton's mole hunt did more damage to American intelligence than any actual Soviet spy operation of the Cold War era. He was, in the words of former CIA officer Cleveland Cram, who was tasked with reviewing Angleton's career after his dismissal, a man whose brilliant mind had become a weapon turned against the agency he served. And at the center of this self-inflicted catastrophe, providing its most visible proof of concept, sat Yuri Nosenko, innocent, isolated, imprisoned. Angleton was finally forced out of the CIA in December 1974, a decade after Nosenko's defection. By that point, Nosenko had been free for 2 years, but the damage was done, and Angleton, to his death in 1987, never admitted he was wrong. In October 1969, Yuri Nosenko was released from his concrete cell. He was given a new identity, a cash settlement, and an official CIA finding, finally, after 5 years of conclusions being delayed, that he was a bona fide defector. He was 41 years old. He had entered CIA custody as a vigorous, sharp-minded intelligence professional. He emerged psychologically scarred, physically deteriorated, and possessing a set of traumas that no government payment could address. His medical records from the period describe significant weight loss, persistent sleep disorders, and symptoms consistent with what we would today classify as severe post-traumatic stress disorder and institutionalization syndrome. The CIA's settlement with Nosenko was kept classified. The amount has never been officially confirmed, though reports have suggested figures in the range of $100,000, approximately $700 for each day of his imprisonment. The agency also remarkably offered him a consulting contract. Yuri Nosenko, the man they had tortured in a box for over 3 years, was hired as a CIA consultant on Soviet intelligence matters. He accepted, because what else do you do? He was in America with a false identity, with no way back. The people who had destroyed him were also the only people who could give him a life. The Church Committee, the Senate Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities, began its landmark investigation of CIA abuses in 1975. It exposed MK Ultra. It exposed assassination plots against foreign leaders. It exposed illegal domestic surveillance. The Nosenko case appeared in its findings. Senator Frank Church described the treatment of Nosenko as outrageous and intolerable. The committee's report confirmed the illegal detention, the sensory deprivation, the systematic psychological abuse. But no prosecutions followed. The officers responsible were not charged. Pete Bagley, the man who built the original case against Nosenko and supervised his interrogations, retired from the CIA with full pension and later wrote a book defending his decisions. James Angleton died in 1987, never having been held legally accountable for the decade-long persecution of a man whose innocence had been internally confirmed while he was still being held. The CIA issued no formal apology to Nosenko. The U.S. government issued no formal apology. The records of exactly what was done to him, the specific interrogation techniques, the full extent of the medical interventions, the precise authorization chain, remain partially classified to this day. In 2019, a Freedom of Information Act request for the complete Nosenko case files was denied in full. 55 years after his defection, the U.S. government is still protecting the details of what it did to him. Here is the thing that makes the Nosenko case truly irreplaceable in the history of Cold War intelligence. If he was genuine, and the overwhelming evidence says he was, then the intelligence he brought with him was real. Nosenko told the CIA which American officials had been compromised by the KGB in Moscow. He provided information that led directly to the identification of KGB listening devices inside the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. He gave the CIA detailed insight into KGB recruitment methodology. That last item is worth pausing on. While Nosenko was being held in a concrete cell, being treated as a Soviet plant, the intelligence he had already provided was identifying real Soviet listening devices inside American diplomatic facilities. His information was leading to real results, and still, they kept him imprisoned. The Oswald file, Nosenko's most explosive claim, has been examined by every serious investigator who has had access to the relevant materials. The House Select Committee on Assassinations in 1979 concluded, after reviewing the Nosenko case, that while his credibility remained a matter of judgment, the underlying claim that the KGB had not recruited Oswald was consistent with all available evidence. No credible evidence has ever emerged that the KGB was involved in Kennedy's assassination. 50 years of declassification has not produced a single document suggesting otherwise. Nosenko's account, delivered in that Geneva embassy in January 1964, appears to have been true. Yuri Nosenko lived in the United States under a protected identity until his death in 2008. He was 80 years old. In the years before his death, he gave limited interviews, carefully, guardedly, and in those interviews, he never expressed bitterness in the way you might expect. He said he understood the CIA's initial suspicion. He said the logic of counterintelligence required them to question him. What he could not reconcile, what he returned to in interview after interview, was not the interrogation itself, but the continuation. The knowledge later confirmed that the CIA had internally concluded he was probably genuine in 1967 and kept him imprisoned for 2 more years anyway. Those 2 years. That gap between the conclusion and the release. That is where the Nosenko case stops being a story about Cold War paranoia and becomes something else entirely. It becomes a story about institutional self-protection, about bureaucracies prioritizing their own reputations over human lives. The CIA did not keep Nosenko imprisoned because they believed he was guilty. By 1967, the evidence of guilt had not survived neutral scrutiny. They kept him imprisoned because releasing him meant confessing to one of the most catastrophic intelligence misjudgments in American history, at a moment when the agency was already under enormous political pressure. And that is the detail that the thumbnail could not show you, that the documents could not fully capture, that only emerges when you line up all the dates and all the memos and all the decisions and ask, simply, why did it take so long? Look at those 2 faces. The man on the left defected because he believed in something. He handed the CIA intelligence that proved genuinely valuable. He asked for protection. The man on the right is what 10 years of the American government's protection looked like. Here is the final revelation this case delivers, and it is not about Yuri Nosenko specifically. It is about the structural flaw that his case exposed in the heart of American intelligence. James Angleton's counterintelligence operation was never about finding moles. It became, over time, about protecting itself, about the preservation of a theory that, if it were wrong, would require Angleton to admit that his entire professional identity was built on a catastrophic misreading of Soviet intentions. The mole he was looking for never existed in the form he imagined. The penetration agent who made Nosenko's case unsolvable, Golitsyn, whose credibility was built on condemning other defectors, has never been definitively validated on his most explosive claims. The spy Angleton sacrificed everything to catch was, largely, a ghost. 40 to 50 CIA careers ended by an internal witch hunt, an agency's Soviet operations paralyzed for years, a man held in solitary confinement for 1,277 days, and at the end of it, no mole found, no confession extracted, no Soviet penetration proved. What Nosenko's story ultimately reveals is the oldest and most dangerous institutional failure, the moment an organization stops asking whether it is right and starts asking only how to prove that it was never wrong. He was the CIA's prisoner, not because of what he had done, not because of what he might do, but because of what acknowledging his innocence would cost the people who imprisoned him. The full case file remains partially classified. There are still pages the U.S. government has not released. 55 years later, there are still things they don't want you to read. Think about what that means, not just for Nosenko's case. For every case like his that has no church committee, no declassification movement, no journalist who stayed with the story long enough to pull the thread. Yuri Nosenko died in 2008. He never received a formal apology from the Central Intelligence Agency. He never received one from the United States government. The men who imprisoned him retired comfortably. The institution that authorized his torture still exists, still operates, still classifies what it does not wish to explain. He survived. That is the only victory this story offers. Against 1,277 days of concrete and darkness, and a government that found it more convenient to leave him there, Yuri Nosenko did his push-ups, recited his poetry, counted his ceiling tiles, and outlasted every one of them. If this story made you feel something, if you found yourself at any point thinking that this should not have been allowed to happen, then understand that the best protection against it happening again is not classified. It is right here in the documented public record, available to anyone willing to look. The next video in this series goes inside another declassified operation that the agency fought even harder to suppress, a program that began 3 years before Nosenko's imprisonment, targeted American citizens on American soil, and whose full architect has still never been publicly named. The open loop has already started. The documents are waiting.